My love, why have you forsaken me?
Hey guys, tonight we open the door to a haunting chapter of history with the tragic story of Juana the Mad, the queen who embraced her husband's corpse for half a century and left an indelible mark between rot and power. You will not only witness a royal tragedy, but also discover how pain and ambition wove the harshest mental prison. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, share where you are and what your current local time is. I really want to know how this community is connecting from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Juana, also known as Juana the Mad, the Queen of Castile and daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand. Juana was born in the year 1473, in a palace both dazzling and filled with power plays. From her earliest days, her fate wasn't her own. She was royal property to be bartered in alliances and power grabs. By the year 1496, Juana was wed to Philip of Habsburg, the so-called handsome prince, son of the Holy Roman Emperor and grandson of the Duke of Burgundy. Everyone thought it was fairy tale material, but in truth, the marriage was like snapping two puzzle pieces together purely for strategic advantage, leaving no room for genuine affection. It was the thrones game, where hearts were not exchanged, only influence. Already known for her fiery temperament and jealousy, Juana stirred the court with public jealous outbursts. Philip, on the other hand, was no stranger to scandal. Their personalities created a drama that was both theatrically amusing from the outside and deeply chilling if you imagine being in Juana's shoes. Then, in the year 1506, the real tragedy struck. Philip died suddenly at the age of 28. That blow was like a thunderclap to Juana. She could not accept that her young husband was gone. Instead of allowing a traditional burial, Juana ordered Philip placed in a black velvet coffin and kept beside her in a private chamber. The grand palace turned into a mausoleum, doors closed tight, no overly bright candle flame, only Juana's solitary figure, her heart cloaked in confusion beside her husband's remains. Weeks passed, months passed, and Philip's body began to decompose, the stench spreading through the corridors. Initially, the court believed it was a phase of mourning that would pass. They planned political ceremonies and a grand funeral to stabilize the kingdom. But week after week, month after month, Juana refused to part from her beloved husband. She secretly opened the coffin, leaned in to inhale the decay, and called it the breath of love. From that moment, Juana's tragedy began to stretch across decades, marking the decline of her spirit and her honor, and directly impacting the Spanish throne. After the unexpected death of Philip, Juana's world shifted from sorrow to obsession in a single devastating moment. Rather than allowing her husband's body a proper burial, she issued an unyielding decree. The coffin, draped in black velvet, was to remain in her private sleeping chamber indefinitely. The grand decor of the royal apartments was stripped away, replaced by heavy black draperies that sealed every window and extinguished all but a single flickering candle. This candle's weak glow cast long shadows across the walls and floor, transforming the living quarters into a somber mausoleum. As the royals and courtiers rushed to perform solemn funeral rites and engage in political ceremonies meant to stabilize the kingdom in the wake of such a loss, Juana withdrew entirely from these rituals. She chose instead to cocoon herself in grief beside Philip's still form, allowing neither protocol nor persuasion to pry his remains from her side. Each morning she would order her attendants to open the coffin lid, revealing the increasingly decayed visage of her once handsome prince. The scent of rotting flesh, stale, sour, and unmistakably human, wafted through the chamber. Yet rather than fleeing in horror, Juana leaned in as though greeting an old friend, inhaling deeply and calling that putrid odor the breath of love. It was as if, in her mind, the closer she remained to the stench of death, the more strongly she could feel Philip's presence beside her. The king's advisors, counsellors, and even the steadfast clergy attempted intervention after intervention. Messengers from the court would arrive each day with letters imploring Juana to abandon this macabre vigil and return to state affairs. Priests brought holy relics and tried to guide her through prayers, hoping to shift her focus back toward the ceremonial aspects of mourning. However, each gentle suggestion was met with anguished sobs. Juana would clutch the coffin's ebony lid, shake it violently, and rip away the black velvet covering just to let the stench pour into her lungs once more. In those frenzied moments, she howled in despair that any attempt to bury Philip would be akin to burying her own heart. In a shocking escalation, Juana then commanded that Philip's coffin accompany her on all travels. The massive iron-bound casket was loaded onto mule carts or carried by pallbearers, creating a grotesque procession through the cities and monasteries of Castile. Wherever she went, the air grew thick with the sweet and sour aroma of decomposition, mixed with the faint scent of candle smoke. Servants and soldiers forced to escort the coffin found themselves fighting waves of nausea. They clutched their stomachs, bowed their heads, and fled behind bushes when possible to heave. Many later confessed that the odour had seeped into their clothing fibres, impervious to even the strongest soaps and countless washings. Along the dusty roads and through cobblestone streets, Juana insisted on halting at every town and convent. There, she would demand that attendants unseal the coffin so she could gaze upon Philip's corrupted features. The face that once charmed diplomats and inked treaties was now a ghastly mask of rot, skin cracked and blackened, eye sockets empty, bone structures revealed in places where the flesh had fallen away. Juana approached this spectacle with a kind of reverent fascination, tracing the ridges of his cheekbones with a trembling finger. Meanwhile, onlookers, peasants, pilgrims, monks, and local dignitaries would witness this horror and scurry away, whispering ominous rumours about the queen who lived with death itself. Word of this ghastly pageant spread like wildfire. Tales of the black velvet coffin and the queen who sleeps with the dead filled taverns, marketplaces, and the corridors of court. Rumours claimed that if anyone dared to close the coffin lid, Juana would unleash a fury that echoed through the night-shattering windows and frightening the horses. The legend painted her as a figure of profound terror, trapped in her own grief-stricken kingdom of decay. Yet, through all this horror, Juana's motive was neither cruelty nor madness alone, but an unbreakable bond she believed death could not sever. In her eyes, the coffin was not a prison but a lifeline. The more rotting the body became, the more secure she felt that Philip's spirit lingered within the decaying flesh. She feared that burying him would disperse his essence, like ashes swept away by the wind. Thus, each inhalation of the stench reinforced her conviction that love twisted, fragmented, and toxic could transcend mortality. By refusing to relinquish the coffin, Juana effectively forfeited her role in governance. The kingdom's affairs passed into the hands of Philip's relatives and court ministers, leaving Juana isolated in her chamber of shadows. The vibrant courts of Castile grew silent, their echo replaced by whispered warnings to avoid the queen's path. Some envoys tipped their hats at a distance, others simply turned away, unable to bear the suffocating combination of duty and disgust. Throughout this saga, Juana remained steadfast in her choice. She wove her life into an unholy tapestry of devotion and decay, each thread marked by the irreversible transformation of palace corridors into corridors of death. In the end, the Queen's caravan of sorrow became a living monument to the devastating power of grief left unchecked. Her story stands as a dark testament to the fragile boundary between love's most tender embrace and the abyss of madness. An enduring legend of Castile that echoes through history as a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest chains are woven not of iron, but of the heart's unyielding yearning. As Philip's body continued to decay, the stench reached an intolerable peak that no amount of incense, scented candles, or fragrant resin could suppress. Juana sealed every door and window in her private chambers, burning Syrian incense incessantly and scattering white vinegar in every corner in a desperate attempt to mask the putrid aroma. Instead of eliminating the odour, these measures blended to create a thick haze, an unholy fusion of rot, smoke, and vinegar that clung to the air like a suffocating shroud. Servants loyal to Juana found themselves changing clothes more often than bedsheets, their linen perpetually saturated with the stench. Many were driven to flight by pounding headaches and relentless bouts of vomiting, Some even pleaded to be moved to the royal stables, claiming that the scent of horse manure was a welcome reprieve compared to the overwhelming odor of her husband's decaying form. Juana herself wholly abandoned any notion of personal hygiene. She refused to wash her hair, allowing it to mat into a tangled bun teeming with lice. When the pests infested her scalp, she would seize a glowing candle and attempt to singe each creature, only to snuff out the flame at the last moment, preserving the lice as almost imperceptible hostages. Her gowns went unlaundered for weeks on end, dust and filth layered upon the fabric, until even a gentle brush caused the garments to disintegrate into brittle fragments. The wash basin in her chamber overflowed with murky water, where a slick film of oil floated atop residue of sweat, vinegar, and clumps of hair. Yet when attendants dared to approach with soap and water, they were met with a curt rebuke. "Do not touch," she commanded, consigning the basin's foul contents to stagnate until the entire court relocated to a new palace. Nighttime brought its own brand of eerie ritual. Juana insisted that Philip's coffin be borne into the adjacent room each evening, partitioned from her bedchamber by two looming folding screens, one shielding the perpetually glowing brazier of incense, the other concealing a row of earthenware vessels brimming with vinegar and wilted herbs. Servants tiptoed across the cold stone floor along a narrow, chalked path, mindful not to brush against the vessel's noxious contents. When the royal entourage passed through the cloistered corridors of the monastery, Juana ordered every window shuttered tight, barring any trace of moonlight or fresh air. She intended to imprison Philip's soul alongside his body, convinced that even a whisper of wind might carry away his essence. In this self-imposed prison, the Queen's chamber existed in perpetual twilight, where only the rhythmic flicker of candlelight punctuated the heavy gloom. The screens swayed slightly as draughts whispered along the corridor, and the stagnant air simmered with the combined reek of decomposition and aged vinegar. Juana lay huddled beneath black velvet drapes, her eyes half-lidded and fixed upon the screens, as though willing the shadowed forms beyond to reveal themselves. She would murmur her husband's name in a soft, weary voice, as if expecting him to answer through the thick veil that separated them, a response that never came. Beyond these walls, whispers of her nocturnal vigil spread throughout Castile like a chill wind. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones of the queen who kept her dead husband at her side, comparing her chamber to a tomb rather than a royal suite. Envoys from distant courts, having been summoned by letters sealed with the royal crest, dared only brief visits. They offered bows at the corridor's threshold and then hurried away, gagging discreetly behind their cloaks. Rumours flourished that any attempt to reseal the coffin would provoke Juana's rage, causing her to unleash a fury that shattered glass and rattled horse hooves in the courtyard below. Despite, or perhaps because of this macabre spectacle, Juana refused to release Philip's remains. In her tormented mind, the more the body decayed, the stronger their bond became. She believed that the unbearable odor was the physical manifestation of their undying love, a sensory proof that death had not conquered their union. Each inhalation of that toxic air was an affirmation. She would not be parted from him, not in life nor in death. Her refusal to relinquish the coffin effectively severed her participation in behalf of governance. The reins of state passed entirely to appointed ministers and councillors who ruled in her name, their fingers on the levers of power, while Juana sank further into her candlelit abyss. Castile's corridors, once bustling with diplomatic intrigue, grew silent. News of her nightly ritual reached the palace kitchens, the chapel pews, and the cobblestone streets, where commoners trembled at the thought of the queen pacing the darkness alongside her rotting husband. Over countless nights, the coffin remained a fixture, as integral to Juana's existence as the bed she lay upon. She fashioned new rites around it, a whispered greeting at dusk, a tender touch at midnight, and a solemn vow at dawn. The coffin became both her sanctuary and her prison, a symbol of devotion warped into a chain that shackled her spirit. And so it was that the Queen's devotion to Philip, once seen as a gesture of undying love, morphed into a grotesque legend, a tale of a sovereign enthralled by death, determined to defy the grave with each breath she took among the flickering candles and the suffocating air. In this tale of relentless devotion, the boundaries between love's most fragile bloom and madness's deepest abyss vanish entirely. Juana's chamber, enshrouded in black drapery, thick incense smoke, and rancid vinegar fumes, stands as a testament to the destructive power of unresolved grief. Her nocturnal vigil left an indelible mark on the fabric of royal history, a dark chapter in the annals of Castile that echoes through the ages, a reminder that even the strongest hearts can falter when confronted by the unyielding finality of death. In the year 1509, the royal family made a controversial decision to confine Queen Juana to the monastery fortress of Tordesillas, perched solemnly on the banks of the Duero River. It was a place of paradox, equal parts, fortress and convent, designed to contain both the physical presence and the spiraling madness of a sovereign more captive to grief than to her own crown. The corridor that led to Juana's cell was narrow and unadorned, the cold stone floor unbroken by carpet, the rough-plastered whitewashed walls quickly stained yellow by damp and cigar-like incense smoke. The solitary window in her chamber was nothing more than a slit barred by heavy felt and wooden planks, admitting only a sliver of daylight that flickered like a dying spark. Inside that dim cell, the furnishings were stark. A single tin table with chipped corners, 2 rough-hewn wooden chairs, a broad 4-poster bed draped in widow's black, and a handful of chests filled with wilted herbs and chipped earthenware bowls of vinegar. Each dawn, the attendant monks replaced the smouldering incense in Juana's brazier. Yet the fragrant smoke only clung to the bed's canopy, coating the fabric in a sticky residue that felt more like congealed wax than cloth. A battered wooden bucket, repurposed as a basin, sat in the corner, brimming with rainwater and vinegar, overlaid by a gelatinous film of hair, sweat, and dregs of herbal detritus. Juana insisted that water remembers every touch, a decree that forbade any servant from emptying or washing the vessel. Whenever a handmaid dared approach with soap and towel, Juana turned away in disgust, sniffed the vinegar-scented handkerchief, and exhaled sharply into her sleeve to avoid inhaling any hint of rot. The environment grew increasingly surreal for those who served the queen. Priests, guard captains, and nuns were required to don cloth masks soaked in vinegar and sprinkle ash outside her door in a feeble attempt to counteract the overwhelming stench. They scurried along a chalked path on the flagstones, careful not to stray from the line, lest they stumble into the pungent vapour clinging to the floor. Each crack in the stone seemed to harbour concentrated pockets of decay, a strategic trap for the unwary foot. Even brief excursions through the monastery's corridors were followed by convulsions of gagging and retching, as the pervasive odour trailed behind like a malevolent spectre. In the adjacent cell, Philip's coffin remained perpetually open. The royal body, now grotesquely emaciated, lay preserved in its black velvet casing, the lid seldom drawn fully shut. Its stench seeped through the partition, suffusing Juana's chamber with a fetid aura she could neither escape nor relinquish. She considered that coffin her tether to reality, a heavy, heart-wrenching connection to the man she refused to acknowledge as dead. In her mind, the decay was a testament to undying devotion, a living shrine to the love that death could not sever. Each morning, Juana awoke to the combined assault of vinegar and incense smoke, the air dense enough to obscure the faint rays of the Sunday. Her eyes would flutter open, bloodshot and weary, fixated on the funeral screens that partitioned her bed from the coffin room beyond. She would murmur Philip's name, an echo carried by the stale breeze that drifted through the narrow window slit, an occasional movement of air she believed might release his soul, if left unchecked. With that thin shaft of light dancing on the rough plaster, Juana seemed to find solace, as though caught between hope and despair. Beyond the confines of Tordesillas, word of the Queen's predicament spread throughout Castile. Courtiers who travelled from the royal court to visit the secluded fortress often arrived with expressions of trepidation. They dismounted at a distance, lit their lanterns at the gate, and after bowing in silent vigil, hastened away, their cloaks flapping like wounded birds. Rumours proliferated that attempting to close Philip's coffin would unleash Juana's wrath in a tempest of broken furniture and shattered pottery, an omen warning all that within those walls, love and madness, had fused into an indomitable force. Despite the isolation, Juana adhered to an unwritten daily ritual. At dusk, she remained beside the bed where the smoke lingered thickest, whispering the lessons she had learned from her grief, that death was not an ending, but a passage into a new form of presence. She reached out, fingers trembling, to touch the silk of her curtained canopy, believing that each thread held the memory of Philip's last breath. She inhaled the heavy incense, hoping its stabilizing warmth would anchor her spirit amidst the shifting tides of sorrow. Then, she would rise slowly, pulling the heavy screens aside to gaze upon the coffin's open maw once more, as though seeking new reassurance that he remained hers. Over the months, Juana came to view the vinegar in the bowls not simply as a disinfectant, but as a symbol of purification, an acidic testament to the raw, unfiltered nature of her devotion. She was convinced that the more acrid the air, the more firmly Philip's soul was bound to the decaying flesh. Each breath she drew was a promise. She would live and die within this shrine, refusing to allow the ebb of mortality to wash away their bond. This fragile chamber, shrouded in black cloth, drenched in incense smoke, and saturated with vinegar fumes, became a microcosm of Juana's fractured mind, a place where grief, rage, and reverence intertwined into a single, unbreakable ritual. The dual screens, the flickering candlelight, the chalked stone path, and the swollen bucket of stagnant water were not mere objects, but the components of a living reliquary. Within its walls, the Queen's love was both sanctuary and prison, a paradox that defined her existence until the end of her days. And so, in the fortress of Tordesillas, beneath the gentle hum of distant bells and the relentless drone of decay, Juana lived out her days in a twilight between life and death. Her nocturnal vigil continued unbroken, a testament to the indelible power of grief and the terrifying lengths one's soul will traverse to hold on to love beyond the grave. In the decrepit quarters where Queen Juana languished, her surroundings were filthier than the most squalid tenements. Monastic staff dared to serve only stale slices of bread, sometimes mold-speckled, and the occasional bowl of cold, thin broth. These meagre offerings, combined with the dank, mildew-laden scent rising from the rotting floorboards, fused with the ever-present stench of Philip's decomposing body, creating what one guard described as a sickly sweet miasma. Juana mastered the peculiar technique of chewing the meagre crumbs without inhaling through her mouth, instead relying solely on her nose to draw in the fumes, a grim ritual that seemed the only path to survival within that noxious chamber. Every so often, she would summon a fragment of leftover meat drained of its moisture and left to lie on the floor until encrusted with grey-green mold before discarding it again, layering the room with fresh pallbearer of decay. It was as if each mouldy morsel served as a monument to her unshakable devotion, a tiny testament to love's capacity to endure, even as it turned rancid. Her youngest child, Princess Catherine, was forced to remain by Juana's side, a pitiable companion in that harrowing tableau. The child's small sobs echoed down the corridor, mingling with the distant toll of monastery bells. On one occasion, clergy sisters attempted to remove the frightened princess from her mother's presence, only to provoke Juana's wrath. The Queen, in a sudden and terrifying display, refused sustenance, screaming until she collapsed in exhaustion. More than one of the gathered priests whispered among themselves that Juana had become a living spectre, defiling the sacred halls with her unhallowed vigil. Winter in the fortress of Tordesillas proved more merciless than any Castilian summer. The briquettes burning low in the brazier hissed and spat hot coals, scalding the air with acrid smoke that seared lung tissue and singed nasopharyngeal passages. The narrow windows, bolted and covered in layers of heavy cloth to keep Philip's wandering spirit confined, offered no relief from the stifling humidity. The canopy above Juana's bed and the curtains surrounding it soaked in every droplet of condensation, fostering black mold on the lining. The stench grew denser, seeping into every stain on plaster walls and fanning out into the corridors, clinging to any passerby's garments as an indelible badge of horror. Servants assigned to the task of cleansing Juana's cell wore vinegar-soaked cloth masks, yet the smell still penetrated their nostrils and even the tiniest holes in the fabric. Many could not endure more than a few minutes before gagging uncontrollably, retreating to the courtyard where they collapsed in gasping fits. Attempts by monks to sprinkle lime or fresh herbs were quickly abandoned as ineffective, the ammonia-like tang of vinegar too weak to counteract the persistent odour of decay. By the year 1510, it was widely believed that Queen Juana had completely lost her sanity. She had no awareness of political developments or the fates of her children, her mind entombed alongside her husband's rotting body. Each dawn, she awoke only to the dull toll of the monastery's bell, a sound that seemed as foreign to her as the concept of day and night. Her only world remained within those dank walls, lit by a single flickering candle, under the oppressive weight of mildew and rot. Yet, despite her profound detachment from worldly affairs, Juana's royal blood provided a measure of protection. The court, wary of upsetting the volatile balance of power, dared not strip her of her title. Instead, they placed her under strict surveillance, entrusting the governance of Castile to regents and councillors who wielded authority in her name. The Queen's isolation spanned more than 40 years, an unbroken vigil in which she neither saw the sun nor heard the laughter of her children as sovereigns in their own right. In that twilight existence, day and night held no meaning. Seasonality dissolved into a relentless sequence of decay. Each breath she took was a testament to survival, each sniff of vinegar and incense an act of defiance against the encroaching rot. Philip's coffin remained steadfast in the adjacent room, a silent sentinel perpetually ajar to allow the fetid air to mingle with the chamber she occupied. Throughout these decades, Juana's plight became a whispered legend among those in the inner circles of power. Diplomatic envoys, wary of the Queen's unpredictable moods, would exchange troubled glances upon learning of her condition. Some wrote dispatches suggesting that her confinement served not only to protect the realm from her unstable presence, but also to shield her from the evil forces she seemed to court by living in perpetual contact with death. When Juana finally passed away late into her 80s, stricken by the frailties of age but still clinging to her vigil, the fortress of Tordesillas exhaled a collective shudder. Philip's coffin was at last removed, sealed, and interred in consecrated ground. Yet even after the corridors were swept clean and the candles extinguished, the memory of that stifling odour lingered like a ghost. The stone walls, though whitewashed anew, bore subtle streaks of yellow that no scrubbing could erase. Travellers who ventured into the now quiet fortress reported an intangible heaviness in the air, as if the very spirits of Juana and Philip remained entwined in the shadows. Juana's centuries-spanning isolation stands as one of history's most tragic examples of grief turned to obsession. For over 40 years, she inhabited a world governed by the scent of decay and the memory of a love she refused to relinquish. And in that self-made tomb, she became both prisoner and jailer. Ensnared by her devotion, yet empowered by the unbreakable chains she had forged in the crucible of her heartbreak. Thus did the Queen of Castile live out her days, a sovereign of rot and shadow, her legacy an enduring cautionary tale of love's perilous edge. In the year 1509, Queen Juana's fate took a tragic turn when her royal family consigned her to the monastery fortress of Tordesillas, a fortress and convent perched atop the banks of the Duero River. With that move, Juana relinquished every role she once held in the grand tapestry of Castilian politics. All official missives, decrees, and petitions intended for her were intercepted at her cell's threshold, never to pass beyond the thick wooden door. Though her son Charles ascended to the prestigious title of Holy Roman Emperor in the year 1519, the news never reached Juana's isolated world. Within the stone-walled enclosure of Tordesillas, time seemed to stand still. Her only companions were the putrid scent of decay, the acrid tang of vinegar, and the ever-flickering glow of a solitary candle that burned day and night, encircled by whitewashed walls, stained yellow with damp and mould. Each dawn, a solemn procession would arrive to bear the king who travelled with Philip's corpse across the cold flagstones. Philip's coffin, still draped in its black velvet, was carried into the adjacent chamber, the door left perpetually ajar so that the rotting stench could drift into Juana's quarters, mingling with the fragrant tendrils of incense smoke. Those tasked with this morbid duty, the monastery's attendants were required to don cloth masks soaked in vinegar, hoping to filter out some portion of the vile odour. They scattered wood ash in neat trails across the floor, then tiptoed along the chalked lines, mindful not to stray from the prescribed path, for a single misstep could send them plunging into the fetid puddles that pooled in hidden crevices of the stonework. Juana never strayed far from that coffin. At her insistence, the lid was opened each day. She would lean forward, lips trembling, and press a mournful kiss to Philip's deteriorated flesh. In a hushed voice that echoed against cold walls, she whispered sweet nothings as though they were shared confidences rather than desperate entreaties to a lifeless form. The stark image of a solitary queen clutching her husband's decaying remains created a tableau both poignant and horrifying, a spectacle of love twisted into a form of living death. As days melted into weeks and weeks into months, the rank stench that emanated from Philip's corpse became Juana's every breath. Thick ribbons of incense smoke, meant to purify her surroundings. Instead, blended with the undertones of putrefaction, forging an unmistakable aroma that haunted the corridors. Each traveller who ventured near her cell returned with tales of that pungent haze, carried like an invisible cloak on their garments. To endure even a few breaths in that atmosphere was to carry the memory of rot itself into the open air beyond the fortress walls. Within this stifling world, Juana's appetite dwindled to near nothing. She subsisted on stale scraps of bread brittle, almost powdered, and the occasional bowl of tepid broth that clung to the tongue with a salty tang. When waves of grief washed over her more fiercely, she would cast aside these pitiful offerings, sending crumbs and splotches of congealed broth skittering across the floor. Over time, these remnants lay untouched, soon sprouting furry patches of grey and green mould. Each bloom of fungus added another layer of miasma, infusing the room with an intensifying stench. It was as if her very devotion to Philip manifested physically through the ever-growing colonies of decay. Word of the queen who slept with her dead husband travelled swiftly across Spain, from the bustling streets of Valladolid to the windswept fishing villages on the Atlantic shore. Whispered legends told of the night when, under a sliver of moonlight, Juana knelt beside the open coffin and pledged herself to Philip's spirit for all eternity. Court poets composed verses that captured the chilling grandeur of her plight. Her heart of stone embraces, a hushed tomb whence no soul escapes. In death's cold arms, love lingers, veiled by rotting tapes and flickering flames. By 1510, any hope of Juana's recovery had vanished. Even her most valiant servants acknowledged that her mind had slipped beyond the brink. She no longer recognized letters stamped with royal seals. She paid no heed to the currency of power or the machinations of statecraft. With the sun never breaking through the narrow window slits of her cell, Juana existed in a perpetual twilight. Her days marked not by sunrise or sunset, but by the steady drip of vinegar and the ragged breath of decay. Yet her royal lineage rendered her immune to outright deposition. The court, fearing backlash from legitimate claims to the throne, refrained from formally stripping her of her title. Instead, they installed a regency council to govern in her stead, leaving Juana under a strict regime of surveillance. No official dared disturb her vigil. Instead, they delegated the mundane tasks to cloistered envoys who moved in shadowy silence, tending to the queen's every need meagre, as it had become before slipping away into the maze-like corridors. Over more than 4 decades, Juana's world shrank to the dimensions of her cell, illuminated only by the faint glow of a candle and the intermittent dance of incense smoke. She never reopened those narrow windows. She felt that any draught might scatter Philip's spirit into the ether. Nor did she acknowledge the changing of seasons beyond the faint chill of winter and the stale heat of summer, both amplified by the sealed environment. Her reality revolved entirely around the coffin, a somber sentinel that anchored her sense of self in a realm where death and love were forever entwined. In those lonely, stagnant days, Juana became an emblem of grief's darkest extremes. Her self-imposed bondage to Philip's remains transcended the physical to become a spiritual commitment, one that she believed would outlast mortal decay. Each day's vigil served as a testament to a love so intense it refused to be quelled by the finality of death. Yet, in the end, it was precisely that refusal, her unwillingness to release Philip's body, that bound her spirit to a life of shadows and rot, imprisoning her in a kingdom of sorrow from which there was no return. Thus did Queen Juana, once a beacon of regal authority, fade into legend as the sovereign who reigned over a realm defined not by courtiers or armies, but by the unyielding presence of decay. And long after the candle gutters were snuffed out and Philip's coffin was finally laid to rest, the memory of that stifling atmosphere, an alchemy of incense, vinegar, and putrefaction lingered like a ghost, a final echo of a love that refused to die. Visitors sent to pay their respects to Queen Juana arrived at Tordesillas fortress in high spirits, bearing gifts and letters of condolence, but left in palpable terror. Bishops, high-ranking nobles, and foreign envoys would offer a hurried bow in the corridor before sprinting toward the courtyard gate, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere. One royal inspector's journal records the horror. Remaining in her chamber for but a few moments, turned our cloaks as dark as nocturnal ash, and plastered them with soot. The Queen's corpse seemed to imprint our every footstep with its presence. Even the devout priests assigned to conduct funeral rites sometimes collapsed mid-chant. overcome by the rank stench that seemed determined to choke any attempt at prayer. For the monastery's attendants, the ordeal was no less nightmarish. They found themselves laundering garments with an urgency that outpaced even the changing of the bedsheets. But no amount of washing could fully expel the stench that had soaked into fabric fibers. As a result, turnover in the serving staff soared. Some petitioned to be reassigned to the royal stables, where the heady tang of horse manure, unpleasant though it was, seemed a relief in comparison. The few who remained resolute against flight and fainting were mandated to carry sachets of potent herbs strapped inside their cloaks and wrap their faces in vinegar-soaked kerchiefs whenever they had to cross the threshold into Juana's quarters. They treaded along the chalked pathway, etched into the cold stone floor, keenly aware that straying from the line might immerse them in a pool of viscous fluid beyond endurance. Outside the stone walls of Tordesillas, the local populace recoiled at the very mention of the Queen's confinement. Villagers shuttered their windows as they passed by, afraid that a single gust of wind might carry the miasma inside their homes. Street vendors retreated to neighboring towns, wary that their wares would be tainted by the pervasive odor. Rumors spread like wildfire. Soon, Tordesillas became synonymous with death and madness throughout Castile. Word spread of funeral processions accompanied by the smell of decay rather than incense, of a queen whose court had been transformed into a living catacomb. Mothers cautioned their children not to wander near the fortress, and teachers would hush their pupils at the mere mention of Juana's name. In princely salons and rural alehouses alike, the tale was told as a grim parable. This is the cost of isolating a queen to preserve the honor of the dynasty, only for that very honor to be sold at the price of an eternal nightmare. In the minds of the people, the fortress's duty to uphold royal prestige had backfired spectacularly. Instead of safeguarding dignity, it had anchored Juana in a perpetual purgatory. The black velvet coffin, once a secret sorrow for a grieving wife, had become a beacon of horror visible across the kingdom. Among the surviving letters smuggled out of Tordesillas, one monk wrote under a trembling hand, "We have become scandalized by the odors forbidden even in the foulest of priest holes. Not the stench of plague, not the rot of fallen soldiers, but something so intimately human that it calls us to tears each time we intrude." Such testimonials circulated among diplomats, who then insisted on wearing scented gloves and minimizing the contact required by protocol. Some courts withdrew ambassadors entirely, unwilling to risk a single ambassadorial fainting fit that might spark a diplomatic scandal. Despite, or perhaps because of this appalling spectacle, Juana's confinement remained ironclad. Her royal lineage, intertwined with the greatest dynasties of Europe, rendered her untouchable by direct deposition. Instead, the Council of Regency decreed strict isolation, ensuring her tomb-like vigil would continue unbroken. The public was told this was necessary for her own protection, but the subtext was clear. Juana's mind was considered a perilous instrument, capable of igniting civil chaos if left unshackled. Over the years, the legend of the rotting queen grew. Bards composed laments and ballads, lamenting a once glorious sovereign reduced to an ostentatious homage to decay. One song, still sung in whispered tones by travelling troubadours, tells of how the smell of her grief devoured the roses of Castile, leaving only thorns that pierced the soul. In written chronicles, some historians condemned the harsh measures taken to contain her, summoning echoes of debate about whether Juana had been truly mad or merely a victim of political expediency. Yet, the common folk perceived no nuance in these debates. To them, Tordesillas was a cautionary landmark, a place where love, grief, and authority had collided to create a horror unmatched in living memory. When travellers recounted distant lands, they would describe Tordesillas as the fortress that imprisoned a queen and, by extension, shackled an entire nation's collective conscience. Generations later, the memory lingered. Tour guides in the 16th century would pause at the fortress's gates and whisper to sightseers about the Queen in black velvet, prompting shivers even among those who had never witnessed the stench firsthand. The walls, though periodically whitewashed, would develop yellow streaks that no amount of fresh lime could erase, lingering reminders of the corrosive atmosphere that had once claimed the roofs and corridors. Ultimately, Juana's forced seclusion revealed a tragic paradox. A queen isolated in the name of preserving dynastic honor, only for that isolation to strip away her dignity, her sanity, and her sense of humanity. The fortress that was supposed to protect the monarchy had instead become a monument to the monarchy's darkest impulses. And in the end, the lingering miasma, an unholy blend of incense, vinegar, and rotting flesh, served as the final testament to a cautionary tale that attempts to confine grief and madness may only compound their power, turning remembrance into a perpetual, inescapable nightmare. In the years that followed Juana's enforced seclusion at the monastery fortress of Tordesillas, her concept of time unraveled completely. Outside her sealed chamber, the great events of the royal court campaigns fought on distant battlefields, grand marriages performed in gilded halls, and even the deaths of those close to her passed by like shadows, unnoticed and unfelt. The only echoes of these events that reached Juana came in the form of furtive whispers and guarded dispatches smuggled into the monastery's secret archives. One chronicle, penned by a weary royal scribe, noted in bleak prose, "The princess lives as a ghost, her every breath and breathless inhalation consumed by the stench of decay." Meanwhile, the children who roamed the corridors of Tordesillas convent spread tales in trembling voices, dubbing her the Queen of Corpses, a moniker that spread from novice to novice like a frightened contagion. Physically, Juana's once regal stature dwindled to a skeletal frame, the consequence of years without proper nourishment or hygiene. Her movements slowed to a deliberate crawl, each footfall hesitant, as though the very act of walking risked dislodging the fragile boundary between life and death she maintained. Her garments, once sumptuous and flowing, now hung in sullen tatters from her narrow shoulders, dark fabric mottled with vinegar stains and ghosts of the fetid aroma that seeped from her chamber. Her hair, unwashed for seasons, tangled into a matted mass that sheltered swarms of lice, each tiny insect carrying the unmistakable tang of damp earth and funeral beer. By night, Juana drew herself beneath the heavy canopy of her four-poster bed, whispering muted invocations to whatever divine forces might heed her call to bind us through the law of odorous union, a private liturgy known only to her and the decaying corpse of Philip. Clerical presence in Juana's chamber dwindled to only the most faint-hearted of priests, each trembling at the mere suggestion of entering her domain. Vesper services were performed in hasty, breathless half-chants, the celebrants fearing that a stray beam of moonlight or the faintest draught blowing through the sealed window slit would spark Juana's rage. On those rare occasions when even the slightest breath of wind stirred the curtains, the queen would erupt in a howl that shattered the silence of pre-dawn gloom. She would lash out fists pounding the velvet draperies, palms smashing against the rough plaster walls, decrying that any intrusion of air would whisk away Philip's soul in a swirling fugue of lost spirits. Such outbursts echoed through the monastic corridors, leaving attendants cowering behind the safety of heavy wooden doors. In response to her fears, the monastery staff sealed every crack and crevice in the walls surrounding Juana's cell. Skilled masons, under strict orders, applied layers of thick acoustic felt, reinforced panels of oak, and tar-soaked rags to ensure that no wind could slip through. The sole concession to daylight was a narrow slit no wider than an iron arrow, a single fracture of light that illuminated the gloom just enough to confirm that the world outside still existed. Within this timbered cocoon, stone floors and velvet hangings soaked in the potent blend of vinegar fumes and incense smoke, sealing the chamber in a state of perpetual dusk. Without natural cycles of sunrise and sunset, Juana's sense of days and nights eroded. Some nights passed in suffocating silence, broken only by the rasp of her breathing and the slow drip of condensation from the vaulted ceiling. Other nights brought the distant toll of bells, signaling canonical hours she no longer understood. In that realm of sensory deprivation and relentless stench, Juana's identity became entwined with her macabre vigil. Philip's coffin, parked like a sentinel in the adjoining room, remained ajar, its lid propped open to allow the stench of decomposition to mingle with the candle glow and the metallic tang of vinegar that permeated every surface. Her days, such as they were, revolved around small rituals dictated by fear and devotion. At dawn, or whatever passed for dawn in that retreat, Juana reached for a handful of coarse breadcrumbs, chewing them slowly without exhaling through her mouth, lest the fetid breath escape through parted lips. She scraped the scum from the glass of water at her bedside and sniffed the residue like a connoisseur assessing vintage wine. And each time she felt the slightest chill or hint of movement in the air, she would journey to the coffin threshold, propping the lid open with trembling fingers to peer at Philip's hollowed cheeks. In that moment she drew strength from the knowledge that his essence still lingered in the rotting garments wrapped around his remains. Though cut off from political counsel, Juana's ghostly existence became legendary among the few envoys permitted to approach Tordesillas. Diplomatic missions dispatched from far-flung courts arrived in hushed reverence. Knights and noblemen swathed in scented cloaks and carrying small packets of myrtle and lavender to mask the oppressive odor. They would bow deeply at the cell's heavily barred door, offer swift formalities, and scramble back to fresh air with gooseflesh lining their arms. Reports from these missions circulated at court, each retelling more lurid than the last, that Juana had grown so frail, her skeletal hands bore little flesh, that her reed-thin voice was barely audible above the hiss of burning incense, that she had taken to reciting sonnets in a drone so sepulchral it sent monks fleeing the chapel in terror. By the year 1510, conviction had settled over the kingdom like a funeral pall. Juana was irretrievably lost to sanity. She knew nothing of the coronation of her successor, nothing of her children's triumphs or travails. Her correspondence was reduced to a few cryptic petitions for more vinegar, more candles, and most urgently a guarantee that the coffin lid would remain perpetually ajar. Meanwhile, her regents and advisers governed in her name, convening councils behind tapestries and dispatching edicts without ever troubling her seclusion. In the end, Juana's life in that hermetically sealed chamber transcended tragedy to become a testament to the destructive power of grief left untempered by compassion. Her once bright spirit dimmed into a hollow echo, a sorrowful murmur beneath the weight of decaying flesh. When at last the queen passed from this mortal coil, her body weakening under the silent onslaught of time, Philip's coffin was finally interred with solemn rites. The lid closed at last. Yet for many who had been touched by her story, the memory of that sealed window, that narrow slip of light, and the all-encompassing fug of vinegar and decay endured as a haunting reminder that in a realm where sorrow is bound and darkness absolute, even the most exalted soul may vanish, leaving behind only a ghostly perfume of loss and lament. In the year 1555, Queen Juana's long vigil finally came to an end. After a staggering half-century spent sequestered alongside her husband's black velvet coffin, she slipped away at the age of 82. For the first time in nearly 50 years, her locked chamber doors were flung open. The royal procession that had borne Philip's body into its neighbouring cell now reversed its route. Attendants lifted his coffin from its permanent place of vigil and carried it out to a proper burial, honouring the rites long denied. Fresh air flooded Juana's former quarters at last, but it could not dispel the lingering odour. Every crack in the whitewashed walls bore streaks of yellow. Every corner of the damp-stained ceiling cried out in mildew, and the bed's canopy remained plastered with soot from decades of incense. These silent witnesses, stubborn burns of time, stood as the final testament to the surreal realm Juana had inhabited. Her only surviving child, Charles V, then the most powerful monarch in Europe as Holy Roman Emperor, did not return to Tordesillas to pay his respects. Spain's court maintained an unspoken embargo on any public acknowledgement of Juana's passing. Rumours and scandal were feared to tarnish the crown's hallowed image, so court decrees insisted on strict confidentiality. Yet word inevitably filtered through the strata of society, and commoners soon found their own ways to commemorate the Queen's extraordinary fate. Across taverns and markets, storytellers wove the legend of the Queen who lived with a corpse, a haunting parable that underscored the perilous intersection of sovereignty and sanity. The fortress convent of Tordesillas, once a bastion of enforced seclusion, swiftly transformed into a pilgrimage site of eerie fascination. Travellers, fueled by tales of black velvet coffins and nightmarish rituals, journeyed from distant provinces to glimpse the place where Juana had carved out her strange dominion. Though royal edicts forbade strangers from approaching the old queen's former cell, pebbled entryways still echoed with the whispers of ghost hunters and history buffs alike. Some visitors claimed they could still detect a faint tang of vinegar on the breeze through the narrow window slits, while others swore they saw flickers of candlelight behind closed doors at dusk. The local guides, sensing an opportunity, pointed out the weathered stones marked by lingering burn marks and moisture stains, warning tourists not to touch lest they be haunted by Juana's restless spirit. In the annals of Spanish history, Juana's tragedy assumed mythic proportions. Chroniclers painted her as the ultimate cautionary figure, a woman ensnared by dynastic ambition, whose undying devotion to her husband transcended even the boundary of death. She became a symbol of the perils lurking behind gilded thrones and whispered treaties, proof that no crown, however resplendent, could shield its wearer from the ravages of grief and madness. Portrayals of Juana in courtly paintings, often posthumous and based on second-hand accounts, depicted her as a gaunt figure draped in black, clutching an empty shroud, eyes hollow with sorrow. These images circulated throughout Europe, serving as grim reminders of a queen's fall from regal grace into morbid infamy. Among the aristocracy, reflections on Juana's life veered between pity and admonition. Some lamented that a more compassionate regency might have spared her descent into despair. Others argued that her forced confinement was a calculated necessity, a measure taken to preserve the realm from echo of her unpredictable mania. Yet nearly everyone agreed that her story revealed a paradox at the heart of monarchical power. In seeking to control destiny, sovereigns risked becoming prisoners of their own authority. Juana's shackles were invisible threads of sorrow, spun by her unwavering refusal to surrender Philip's remains to the earth. Down in the villages, the legend took on more folkloric hues. Mothers would hush mischievous children with threats that Juana's ghost roamed the corridors at night, searching for her lost love. Poets penned verses of haunting beauty, comparing her vigil to that of a star forever fixed in the heavens, shining with grief's cold light. One popular ballad, titled "The Velvet Coffin," painted a portrait of Juana kneeling in candlelit gloom, her voice trembling as she implored Philip's shade to speak through the veil of rot. Beneath silken shroud in silent keep, I wait for breath that time can't claim. Though flesh decays in shadowed sleep, my heart endure, eternal flame. By the time the year 1560 dawned, scholars and philosophers beyond Spain found in Juana's ordeal a cautionary tale for ages to come. Enlightenment thinkers would later cite her as an example of how unbridled devotion could tip into fanaticism, and how rigid social structures could crush the human spirit. In academic circles, debates raged over whether Juana's commitment to the law of odorous union was madness or a poignant metaphor for the limits of human agency. In more recent centuries, the chamber that had once trapped Juana in a web of sorrow became a subject of restoration and reinterpretation. Heritage preservationists, donning masks and gloves, painstakingly removed layers of soot and mildew, striving to reveal the original whitewash beneath. Yet every effort to scrub away history seemed to stir up new streaks of discoloration, like memories refusing to fade. By the turn of the 20th century, Tordesillas had reopened its doors as a museum of sorts, complete with guided tours that allowed visitors to stand before the very door that had sealed Juana's fate. Audio recordings played whispered passages from her own petitions, and candlelit corners recreated the oppressive ambience of her vigil. Present-day travelers often remark on the uncanny stillness of the old convent, the way sound seems to vanish into thick stone walls. Guidebooks warn that even the most skeptical minds can feel a chill, as if the legacy of Juana's grief has become woven into the fortress's very foundation. Some nighttime ghost tours claim to play back faint echoes of creaking floorboards and hushed murmurs, though skeptics dismiss these as theatrical contrivances. Nonetheless, the tale endures, a dark jewel in Castile's crown of legends. Through it all, Juana the Mad remains indelible in collective memory. Her reign, if it can be called that, shrank to a silent cell where the line between love and obsession blurred into rot. She was a queen who died never fully at rest, her final gesture one of reluctant release. And though her coffin was closed at last, and Philip's remains finally laid to earth, their story echoes on in the stone corridors and yellowed frescoes of Tordesillas. It stands as an enduring testament to the paradox of power, that the greatest authority may yet offer the least protection, leaving behind only the lingering perfume of sorrow and the faintest flicker of a candle in the dark. The tragic tale of Juana the Mad evokes the image of absurd sovereignty, where power and political ambition drive a person to the abyss of the mind. From a modern perspective, her decades-long embrace of her husband's corpse is unmistakable evidence of a severe psychological disorder. Yet it also stands as a natural consequence of an arranged marriage designed purely for dynastic gains, a union in which Juana's own heart was never free but always bound by political calculations. History records Juana as the vivid symbol of loneliness upon the throne. Though she wielded royal authority, she had no right to determine her own fate. From the moment she was confined within the monastery walls, she was severed from news of her family, her power, and the intrigues of court. Her world narrowed to the dimly lit cell, where ragged breaths and the stench of decay were her sole companions. Juana's story is a warning to future generations about the value of personal freedom. When individuals lose agency over their own lives, no amount of outward splendor or prestige can conceal the hollow emptiness within. Her tragedy illustrates the terrifying power of grief to shatter reason, transforming love into invisible shackles that bind the soul to an inescapable prison. Half a millennium later, Juana the Mad's ordeal still haunts us as a stark reminder of the fragile boundary between power, love, and madness. Absolute authority entwined with obsessive devotion can yield a devastating outcome. While history may forget many events, the legend of the queen who lived with a corpse endures as proof that power does not invariably save humanity. At times, it can spawn tragedy. This is a historical lesson worth deep reflection. The ascendancy of a dynasty must never come at the cost of a human soul's destruction. Juana the Mad transcends her role as a relic of the past. She stands as a manifesto for the future. Only when individuals are respected with the freedom and autonomy to shape their own destinies can power hold true meaning without inflicting irreparable wounds. And so Juana's tragedy did not end as a mere historical lesson about power and madness, but opened a final, haunting chapter. After surviving half a century amid the stench of decay and bizarre rituals, she not only lost her connection to the living world, but became utterly detached from any sense of time and space. Let us now reflect on the final details of her life. In her last years, Juana drifted ever further from reality. Each time the procession carried Philip's coffin to a new royal residence, she demanded the lid be opened to inspect her husband's soul. The stench grew so overpowering that many soldiers and clerics fainted in the corridors. They later described Juana bending over the coffin, tears streaming down her face, her trembling hand brushing the jet-black flesh of the corpse as she whispered prayers. She believed that unless she inhaled that odor, Philip's soul would slip away. By day, the windows were always bolted shut, and light filtered only through narrow cracks in the boarded-up planks, creating a gloom reminiscent of a tomb. Pillars of ash and piles of withered herbs were scattered across the floor, leaving pale streaks of yellow and grey along the walls, footprints of servants too embarrassed to approach directly. Juana isolated herself completely. She forbade anyone from leaving the room without her express permission, and did not allow a single object to be cleaned or moved. Juana's health visibly deteriorated. She would nibble on stale scraps of bread and sip spoonfuls of vinegar, only to hurl them to the floor when exhaustion overcame her. Her body grew gaunt, her skin took on a sickly pallor, and her limbs shook with weakness. On several occasions the court attempted to send a rescue party to reach her, but Juana flew into a rage, calling them soul thieves, and threatening to fling her husband's remains onto the altar if they did not withdraw. In the end, no one dared intervene directly. Her chamber, where the corpse was moved, became known as the gates of hell to all who entered. It was said that the stench clung to one's garments so stubbornly that no amount of laundering could remove it. Legend has it that a foreign ambassador, after an audience, was forced to cut off his costly cloak and bury it just outside the monastery wall because the cursed odor would not let go. Tales such as these spread throughout Europe, transforming Juana into a symbol of terror and grotesque fascination. Now let's drift deeper into Juana's tragic saga, focusing on her relationship with her own children, her offspring destined to inherit crowns, including Charles V, the future Holy Roman Emperor. Yet from the moment Philip died, Juana regarded her children with suspicion, as if they were silent enemies, poised to bury her husband's soul alive. One misty morning, her princes and princesses, clad in princely robes of crimson and azure, knelt before their mother, petitioning to finally lay their father to rest. What seems a simple plea to us erupted into calamity in Juana's eyes. She shook with rage, tears mixing with sweat, and cursed them as greedy traitors. Their pleas were met by her thunderous threat. "Should you dare defile him, I will strip you of your rights to the crown." The resounding crack of her voice sent the royal hall into stunned silence. From that moment on, the princes and princesses were barred from seeing their mother directly. They could only glimpse her through the narrow slats of a bolted door, peering at her as she sat alone in the dreary chamber with that black velvet coffin. Their small forms huddled in the hallway, eyes downcast, hearts pounding, unable to deliver a final farewell. This forced distance only tightened Juana's paranoia. On certain nights, she would erupt into screams, declaring she would die with my husband, stipulating that she could only live on if she smelled the stench. Her mental state deteriorated drastically. Days and nights blurred together, seasons vanished, and she charted her life by an internal map of odors. Each dawn, she marked the spot where the vinegar tang was strongest. By dusk, she traced the colder swirl of incense smoke, her only gauge of time. Devoid of meaningful interaction with her children, Juana lost her maternal role. Letters from her offspring begging permission for a proper burial, or simply inquiring about court matters, were intercepted at her door, never to be read. Their tear-stained missives vanished into the void, leaving them unheard. Soon, the court realized they could not contend with Juana's obsessive mania. Every attempt to calm her backfired, creating greater chaos in the court and jeopardizing the stability of the kingdom. Political power was officially entrusted to her heirs and the Council of Regents. Charles V, now emperor, issued edicts and restored order, while mighty nobles like the Duke of Mendoza and Prince Ferdinand steered the kingdom's affairs. Juana became a ghostly presence, draped in incense haze, and decay a silhouette with no voice in state matters, her realm reduced to that fetid room. There, she wove elaborate rituals around Philip's remains, clinging to them as her sole source of spiritual armor. On rare occasions, brave counselors sneaked into her chamber, only to find Juana prostrate before the coffin, lips moving in arcane whispers. She believed that only the completion of daily rites, placing a hand upon the velvet lid, inhaling the rancid air, kneeling 3 times, would maintain the fragile balance between life and death. Without these rites, she was convinced Philip's spirit would slip away, taking her own with it. Each night, candle flames cast dancing shadows on the funeral screens, creating an eerie interplay of light and dark. The mingled fumes of vinegar and decay clung to every drape and garment, a near physical presence that invaded the nostrils of all who dared approach. Occasionally, faint sobs echoed through the halls, Juana's ragged breaths reminding all that she still lived, bound to a love that death could not sever, yet carried her into madness. Thus did the court of Tordesillas become a phantom court. Those who tried to intervene pulled back in terror, carrying with them an enduring memory of the choking stench. It was said that within those walls, maternal warmth had been replaced by a sovereign's isolation, and the only throne was that black coffin guarded by endless ritual. So, in this final chapter, Juana transformed from a powerful queen into a prisoner of her own making. She was severed from everyone, even her own children, and her life revolved entirely around her bizarre ceremonies with her husband's corpse. Power slipped through her fingers and settled in the hands of others. Her legacy was not one of glory, but of unthinkable solitude, shrouded in the lingering stench of a love that refused to die. In the year 1555, Juana's life ended in utter solitude. Her chamber floor, once soaked with pools of decay and a fine layer of ashes, still bore stark black stains on the cold stone. When the last candle guttered out, the air remained so heavy that attendants had to wear vinegar-soaked masks to even step inside. Pallbearers gently lifted Juana's frail body, withered and ashen, into a simple bier. Her black velvet coffin, long a symbol of her eerie vigil, was at last carried out for cremation according to Catholic rites. For the first time in half a century, her chamber's sealed window flung open, allowing a rush of fresh air inside. Witnesses later recalled how, upon drawing back the black drapes, the stench that had lain dormant burst forth, engulfing the courtyard in a cloud of gloom that forced onlookers to stagger backward in horror. The funeral was hurried and solemn. Flickering candles lined the narrow aisle, and hurried prayers echoed with barely concealed grief. Juana's remains were then interred in the family vault beside Philip's, finally burying the stench beneath damp earth. Though the aroma of decay was buried at last, the monastery itself remained scarred. Yellowed blotches stained the walls, plaster crumbled in patches, and the floor, polished by decades of trodden ash, glistened sorrowfully underfoot. Soon after, Tordesillas underwent a grand refurbishment. Craftsmen replastered and repainted the walls, wiping down corridors and sweeping away dust. Yet no matter how thick the new limewash, the yellow stains reappeared like stubborn ghosts. It was as though Juana's tragedy had impregnated every stone, every brushstroke, forever beyond erasure. Across Spain, tales of the Queen of Rot spread as a macabre legend. Gourmands of the strange would whisper about pilgrims bringing black velvet scraps from the old chamber, keeping them as talismans. Adventurers flocked to Tordesillas to glimpse the decrepit room where Juana had held her vigil, sitting by the scorched walls and inhaling the lingering ash dust. Guidebooks noted reports of amateur archaeologists who tried to collect splinters from her bed, only to be struck ill by nausea that forced them to retreat at dusk. Once a symbol of Habsburg, Castile's might, the fortress convent now stood as an eerie monument to ambition's dark rent. Rather than a bastion of power and prayer, it had become a living relic of regal despair. Its corridors haunted by the memory of incense smoke, vinegar fumes, and the relentless presence of decay. Thus Juana la Loca's story closed not with glory, but with an unsettling tableau, the hush of flickering candles overshadowed by the stench of death. Yet in that very horror lay a timeless lesson. In the absence of power, only solitude remains an echo that resonates through the stones of Tordesillas and beyond. Thus ends the journey of Juana the Mad, leaving us with countless reflections. Her story offers a profound lesson in compassion. When we see someone lost in the grip of power and isolation, we should not rush to judgment, but place ourselves in their shoes. In today's world, whether emperor or ordinary citizen, the suffering of loss must be shared and healed. It cannot be confined by rigid laws or solemn ceremonies. Juana, with her half-century vigil beside her husband's corpse, stands as a haunting symbol of a woman drawn into political machinations and ultimately crushed by pressure and utter isolation. Moreover, Juana's tragedy reminds us that mental health is priceless. When someone loses the ability to share their burdens and receive community support, they can easily tumble into a chasm of despair. In our era of psychological awareness, Juana's story should resonate as a warning. Never let anyone, even those at the highest stations, face the ghosts of their past alone. A simple word of concern, a single candle lit in the dark, can be enough to stave off the collapse of a fragile soul. Finally, the legend of Juana is soaked in macabre tones yet suffused with sorrow and deep humanity. It is a call to maintain empathy for those on life's precipices and to honor true love, love untainted by ambition or pain. Juana the Mad, forever linked to that pervasive stench, lives on in the collective memory as proof that power cannot compensate for the wounds it inflicts. And you know, when you turn off the lights and allow yourself to sink into the stillness of the night, you might hear Juana's gentle breath, a subtle invitation to remember that each of us needs a bit of light and warmth from shared compassion. Thank you for accompanying me on this journey. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, and leave a comment about the historical tales you'd like to explore next. Wishing you a peaceful night, and I'll see you in the next video.